Good morning, and welcome to your daily briefing. Today is February 22nd, 2023. I'm glad you're here, and I have a lot to get through today, so let's dive right in. We're going to start with something a little bittersweet. If you've been a subscriber to the New York Times newsletter Debatable, written by staff editor Spencer Bockett-Lindell, you may have already heard. This week marks the final edition of that newsletter. Bockett-Lindell has been writing it since 2019, and his stated mission from the very beginning was to cut through the noise of what he called the hot take industrial complex, to offer readers a real entry point into the most complex, pressing debates of our time. He says he hopes those debates continue, and readers will now find sharp commentary and analysis in the Times Opinion Today newsletter, sent Monday through Saturday. But rather than say goodbye with a single topic, Bockett-Lindell used this final issue as a kind of retrospective, a curated look back at the debates that have defined these past few years and that, in his view, will continue to matter for years to come. And what a list it is. Today, we're going to walk through many of those debates together. Think of this as a panoramic view of the issues that have dominated American and global life in recent years, from climate change to democracy, from the war in Ukraine to the question of what we owe future generations. Let's start where Bockett-Lindell started, climate change. Now, when he told friends and fellow journalists he was writing about climate, he often got a quizzical look. What's left to debate? They'd ask. The science is settled. And yes, the science of whether climate change is happening and whether humans are causing it. That's not in serious dispute. But as Bockett-Lindell points out, there is an enormous amount left to debate about how we respond to it, and those debates touch nearly every part of our lives. Take the most basic question. Is it even politically and technologically possible for the United States to zero out greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement? When President Biden took office in January 2021, he signed a wave of executive orders formally enshrining climate action across every level of the federal government. Gene Karpinski, president of the League of Conservation Voters, called it the single biggest day for climate action in more than a decade. The goal: 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035 and net zero emissions by 2050. Many scientists say this is technically feasible and economically affordable. But the politics, as Biden quickly discovered, are another matter entirely. His plan would cost $2 trillion over 4 years. Getting that through Congress required navigating the filibuster, which requires 60 votes in the Senate to pass most major legislation. And standing squarely in the way was Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a man who, in 2010, literally filmed a campaign ad where he shot a physical copy of a climate bill with a hunting rifle, and who now chairs the Senate Energy Committee. 6 months into the Biden presidency, the status of his climate agenda was already in trouble. A bipartisan infrastructure deal had stripped out most of the ambitious climate provisions, about $1 trillion worth, according to the World Resources Institute, making it, in the view of climate experts, impossible for the U.S. to meet its commitment to cut emissions in half by 2030. Democrats tried to thread the needle through budget reconciliation, a process that requires only 50 votes. But even that path was narrow, contingent, and uncertain. What's the core policy debate here? It comes down to two main approaches. The first is a carbon tax, essentially pricing fossil fuels to reflect their true environmental cost, using market forces to drive the economy away from them. Economists love this idea. It's elegant in theory, but it's been a political disaster wherever it's been tried. Even Washington state failed to pass one by ballot referendum, twice. Why? Because carbon taxes raise costs for every energy consumer immediately. They create enemies before they create benefits. The second approach, the one Democrats have been pursuing, is a clean energy standard, a legal requirement that utilities get 80% of their electricity from zero-carbon sources by 2030 and 100% by 2035. It's less cost-efficient by some economic measures, but it has real-world precedents. 10 states had already passed similar standards before the federal debate even got going. There's also an idea that's gained traction but not yet mainstream political support, a carbon tariff, which would tax imports from countries that aren't reducing their own emissions. The Times columnist Paul Krugman argued this was defensible even without a domestic carbon price. Critics called it greenwash protectionism. The debate continues. And then there's the question that Bockett-Lindell poses starkly. Can the U.S. really drive its way out of climate change? Gas-powered vehicles are the single biggest source of greenhouse gases in America, more than a quarter of total emissions. President Biden signed an executive order promising that by 2030, half of all new vehicles sold would be electric. General Motors, Mercedes, Volvo, Ford, automakers started announcing phase-outs of gas-powered cars. The EV market in 2021 was still only 2% of new car sales, but some analysts compared it to the internet in the late 1990s. Explosive, disruptive growth just around the corner. But here's the complication that Times columnist Farhad Manjoo raised. Maybe the problem isn't just the type of fuel, but the entire car-dependent structure of American life. If electric vehicles are going to help solve climate change, they'll need to be paired with dramatic land use reform, more transit, more biking, more walkable communities. And that requires a fundamentally different vision of what American cities and suburbs look like. The infrastructure bill Congress passed in 2021 allocated only $7.5 billion for EV charging stations, half of Biden's original request, and did not expand purchase incentives. Automakers said widespread adoption couldn't happen without more investment, and the bill allocated about 3 times as much money for highways as for public transit. Then there was the gas stove controversy. Earlier in 2023, a U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission official suggested regulators were considering new rules on gas stoves because of growing evidence linking them to hazardous indoor air pollution. Republican Congressman Ronnie Jackson of Texas tweeted that if the maniacs in the White House come for my stove, they can pry it from my cold, dead hands. The CPSC quickly walked back the suggestion. President Biden's office said he didn't support a ban either, but the underlying health debate was real. Gas stoves release nitrogen dioxide, a respiratory irritant, at levels that would be illegal outdoors. A December meta-analysis found that 12.7% of childhood asthma cases in the U.S. may be attributable to gas stove use, comparable to secondhand smoke. Methane leakage from gas stoves, mostly when they're off, has the same warming effect as the annual carbon dioxide emissions of 500,000 cars. The alternative? Induction cooktops, which use magnetic fields to heat cookware directly. They're more efficient, more responsive, and Times food columnist Melissa Clark found she preferred them over gas once she tried them. So did the chef Eric Reipert of Le Bernardin. Yet only 3% of American homes have induction technology. One important note from that debate: from a climate standpoint, gas stoves aren't actually the biggest household emitter. Most household natural gas use comes from boilers for heating and hot water. As Farhad Manjoo argued, if you want to make the biggest climate impact at home, your money is better spent on a heat pump or weatherizing your house than on a new stove. Now let's zoom out to the big picture on climate science. In August 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released what the New York Times described as the most comprehensive summary to date of the physical science of climate change. The conclusion was stark. The planet has already warmed by roughly 1.1 degrees Celsius since the 19th century, and no matter what we do now, temperatures will likely reach 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades. That future is, in the panel's words, essentially locked in. What does 1.5 degrees of warming mean? Nearly 1 billion people could be exposed to more frequent life-threatening heat waves. Hundreds of millions would face severe droughts. Coral reefs, which sustain fisheries for large parts of the globe, will suffer more frequent mass die-offs. Sea levels will rise another 1 to 2 feet this century. But scientists are equally clear that it matters enormously whether the world stops at 1.5 degrees or lets temperatures rise to 2, 3, or even 4 degrees. Every additional degree of warming compounds the risks: more severe floods, more intense heat waves, accelerating sea level rise, and a growing chance of crossing irreversible tipping points, like the collapse of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. Summer 2021 brought this home viscerally. Nearly a third of Americans lived in a county hit by a weather disaster in just 3 months, up from about a tenth of the country over the same period 5 years earlier. The Pacific Northwest heat wave that June was so extreme that pre-existing statistical models said it should have been virtually impossible, even accounting for climate change. Scientists were genuinely unsettled. Everybody is really worried about the implications of these events, said Geert Jan van Oldenborg of the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute. We feel we do not understand heat waves as well as we thought we did. This brings us to the question of adaptation, a subject that has moved from the margins to the center of the climate conversation. A Harvard climate expert coined an axiom 14 years ago. Humanity faces 3 choices in response to climate change: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation we need, and the less we suffer. But nations have delayed long enough that some degree of all three is now inevitable. What does adaptation look like in practice? Rethinking how we farm, more precise irrigation, relocation of production, climate-controlled buildings. Rebuilding infrastructure not for the weather of the past, but the weather of the future. Restoring wetlands and expanding green space to protect against flooding. And in some places, getting out of the way entirely, moving people and communities away from coastlines and floodplains that are becoming uninhabitable. The federal government currently spends about $46 billion per year on disaster recovery, roughly 7 times what it spends on resilience. Too often, that recovery money is spent rebuilding in exactly the same places that will be hit again. There is no national adaptation plan. There is no national climate migration plan. The Netherlands, by comparison, has government water boards with ultimate authority over land use and the power to relocate entire communities before a disaster strikes. In the U.S., that kind of proactive government action runs headlong into deeply held beliefs about private property rights. Let's talk about some of the more speculative technological options on the table. Should nuclear power play a bigger role? Today, the U.S. gets about 20% of its electricity from nuclear, a technology that produces no carbon dioxide and has killed far fewer people than fossil fuels. France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear and has among the lowest per capita carbon emissions in Europe. Nuclear power's proponents argue it's the fastest path to decarbonization, pointing to France's example in the 1970s as the fastest decarbonization effort in recorded history. But nuclear power faces serious obstacles. It's extremely expensive to build. Solar power now generates the cheapest electricity in history, so cheap that new solar projects can compete with existing nuclear plants. Nuclear plants take more than a decade to build. Public opinion is unfavorable, and there's still no national repository for nuclear waste in the United States. Congress chose a site in Nevada in 1987, but local and federal opposition has blocked construction ever since. Some climate experts argue the U.S. should at least preserve its existing nuclear fleet, because in countries where nuclear has been phased out, Japan, Germany, Belgium, fossil fuels have picked up the slack. What about nuclear fusion? The dream of creating limitless, clean energy by replicating the process that powers the sun. In December 2022, researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California made history. For the first time ever, a controlled nuclear fusion reaction produced more energy than it took to start. The Biden administration has said it hopes to make commercial fusion energy a reality by 2032. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm called it a true breakthrough moment. But scientists caution that enormous technological and economic hurdles remain. The lasers used in the experiment were terribly inefficient, the fuel targets cost thousands of dollars each, and a commercial fusion power plant is still, in the estimate of the Livermore Labs director, a few decades away. For now, most climate scientists say the world should focus on scaling up the renewable technologies it already has. What about lab-grown meat? Meat and dairy production accounts for about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with cattle responsible for about 2/3. The world is getting richer, and richer countries eat more meat. Global meat production has more than quadrupled since 1961. Lab-grown, or cultured, meat, real meat grown from cell lines without slaughter, has attracted enormous investment. A restaurant in Singapore even put lab-grown chicken on its menu. But as of now, the economics and engineering challenges remain daunting. A single nugget from one company initially cost $50 to produce. Even the CEO of one of the leading cultured meat companies called it very uncertain whether the technology could displace conventional meat in the next 30 years. And then there's geoengineering, perhaps the most controversial idea in climate science. What if humanity deliberately altered the Earth's atmosphere to counteract warming? One approach, stratospheric aerosol injection, would spray reflective particles into the upper atmosphere to bounce sunlight back into space, similar to what happens naturally after a large volcanic eruption. A startup called Make Sunsets claimed earlier this year to have launched weather balloons filled with reflective sulfur particles over Baja California, a first-of-its-kind field test. The appeal, it would be relatively cheap, as little as $2 billion per year. The danger, the side effects could be catastrophic. Spraying sulfur into the stratosphere could turn the sky white, disrupt monsoon patterns, increase the spread of malaria, deplete the ozone layer, and create winners and losers across different regions of the world. It would also need to continue indefinitely, because if you stop, All the warming that was masked could come rushing back at once. And it does nothing to address ocean acidification, which is driven by the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not by temperature. More than 360 scientists and governance scholars have signed an open letter calling on governments to restrict the development of solar geoengineering technology. Now let's shift from climate to the state of democracy, a topic that has been, in Bucket Lindell's words, one of the most turbulent of the past several years. At the global level, the data is grim. According to VDEM, the monitoring institute based in Sweden, more democracies were deteriorating and even slipping into autocracy in 2021 than at any point in the past 50 years. The third wave of democratization that began in the mid-1970s and crested at a record 42 liberal democracies in 2012 has been rolling back. Today, only 34 liberal democracies exist, the same number as in 1995. In Italy, voters handed power to a coalition led by a party directly descended from Benito Mussolini's fascist movement. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has presided over a sharp rise in Hindu nationalism and targeted repression of the Muslim minority. In the Philippines, voters elected the son of a former dictator. In El Salvador, the president deployed the army inside Congress to pressure legislators. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has built what he calls an illiberal democracy, eroding civil liberties, subjugating the judiciary, and restructuring the electoral system to entrench his power. He has become a model to the far right around the world, including, openly, in the United States. What's driving this global trend? Political scientists point to several forces: backlash to social change, demographic shifts, and the strengthening of minority ethnic or religious identities, growing inequality, and the erosion of the middle class under globalized capitalism, the fragmentation of political power among multiple parties, which makes democratic governments appear incapable of solving problems, and the rise of social media as an amplifier of polarization and anger. In the United States, the January 6th Capitol attack raised the stakes dramatically. Bucket Lindell asked, was that a bullet dodged or a dress rehearsal for something more successful? Election law expert Richard Hassan warned, in a paper published in late 2021, that the United States faces a serious risk that the 2024 presidential election could be unfair and that results could be manipulated after the fact. Republican-controlled legislatures had, between January and June of that year, passed 24 laws across 14 states to increase their control over how elections are run, stripping secretaries of state of their power, making it easier to overturn results. Hassan identified 3 specific mechanisms for subversion: state legislatures swapping in their own slate of presidential electors, fraudulent or norm-breaking election administration, and vigilante action to interfere with ballot counting or the transfer of power. These weren't abstract fears. A conservative lawyer named John Eastman had drafted a plan, revealed by reporting from Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, for Vice President Mike Pence to throw out the electoral votes of key swing states. 10 of 15 declared Republican candidates for Secretary of State in 5 swing states had either declared the 2020 election stolen or demanded its investigation. Others, including the Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, argued that the more likely threat wasn't outright civil war, but rather a slower slide toward a Hungarian-style soft autocracy, one that uses the machinery of democratic legitimacy to entrench minority rule. This concern was echoed by the Supreme Court's 2022 decisions overturning Roe v. Wade and striking down New York's gun law. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer declared in dissent that the abortion ruling had damaged the court's legitimacy. Only 25% of Americans said they had confidence in the Supreme Court heading into those rulings, down from 36% just a year earlier. What can be done to reform the Supreme Court? Bucket Lindell surveyed 3 approaches. The first is expanding the number of justices. The court's size is not constitutionally mandated and has been changed 7 times in American history. But critics warn this risks triggering a retaliatory spiral between parties. The second is term limits, limiting justices to 18-year, staggered terms, so that every president gets roughly 2 appointments per term. This has broad support across the political spectrum, but may require a constitutional amendment. The third is disempowering reforms, weakening the court's power itself, such as requiring a supermajority of 6 or 7 justices to overturn a federal law. The Voting Rights Act was another battleground. In July 2021, the Supreme Court upheld 2 Arizona voting restrictions that critics argued disproportionately affected voters of color, using a legal test that some lawyers said would make it very difficult to challenge most voting restrictions going forward. Since November 2020, at least 22 laws had been enacted in 14 states imposing new voting restrictions. Democrats pushed the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act through the House, but both stalled in the Senate, blocked by the filibuster and by the opposition of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to changing it. As one analyst put it, Democrats claim democracy is under threat, but they lack the collective will to save it. Let's turn to the war in Ukraine, a story that, in Bucket Lindell's words, is still without an end in sight. President Vladimir Putin of Russia launched what became the biggest military conflict in Europe since World War II, and in doing so changed nearly every aspect of global politics. In late February 2022, as Russian troops invaded, Putin put Russia's nuclear forces into a higher state of alert for the first time since the Russian Federation was established in 1991. Experts called it unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. The prospect of nuclear war, which most people had assumed was safely in the past, suddenly returned to the foreground of global consciousness. Early in the war, Russia's military campaign stalled badly, failing to achieve its major objectives and losing, by U.S. estimates, more than 7,000 troops in the first month. But Putin responded to military setbacks by escalating his bombing campaign against civilian targets, a strategy that one Times columnist described as a bid to create so many refugees that NATO countries would pressure Ukraine to accept Russia's terms. What would a diplomatic solution look like? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signaled openness to giving up his country's aspirations for NATO membership, but not to surrendering territory or Kyiv. Russia has demanded Ukrainian neutrality and has talked of retaining the 4 regions it illegally annexed. Western officials expressed skepticism about Russian good faith. Some analysts were cautiously optimistic about a possible opening after Russia moderated its public demands. In February 2023, just before this newsletter was published, President Biden made a dramatic surprise visit to Kyiv, a 10-hour overnight train ride through Ukraine. He stood with Zelensky outside St. Michael's Monastery as air raid sirens sounded, promising another $500 million in military aid. 1 year later, Kyiv stands, Biden declared. Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The visit was kept secret until the last possible moment, and even Biden's own public schedule showed him still in Washington while he was halfway across Europe. Meanwhile, the war fundamentally disrupted the global energy order. Europe had been deeply dependent on Russia, which supplied about 1/3 of its oil and 40% of its natural gas. Germany was especially dependent. After the invasion, Germany earmarked €200 billion for renewable energy investment over the next 4 years. The European Union pledged to slash Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the following winter and eliminate them entirely by 2027. The war became, in the words of the International Energy Agency's director, an accelerator for clean energy transitions. In 2022, an estimated $1.4 trillion flowed into clean energy projects, more than the money invested in new oil and gas, and nearly 15% of all new car sales globally were electric. But the war also raised the question of deglobalization. The chief executive of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, declared the invasion may mark an end to the globalization we have experienced over the last 3 decades. The coordinated campaign to cut Russia off from the global economy was historically unprecedented. Countries began reassessing their dependence on foreign suppliers for everything from energy to food to semiconductors. China was watching closely and accelerating its own efforts to reduce dependence on foreign agricultural imports. And what about the nuclear question specifically? In the fall of 2022, as Ukrainian forces pushed back Russian advances, Putin made a televised speech threatening to use all the means at our disposal to protect Russian territory. Territory he now claimed included 4 Ukrainian regions he had illegally annexed. Ukraine's intelligence agencies said the risk of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons was very high. U.S. officials maintained the risk was low but acknowledged they were more worried than at the start of the conflict and had begun gaming out post-strike scenarios. If Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, what would the world do? National security experts debated options ranging from a U.S. nuclear response, which could restore deterrence but risks escalation to full-scale nuclear war, to a conventional military response targeting the origin point of the strike, to expanded economic sanctions and greater military support to Ukraine. Some analysts warned that even a conventional military response would mean a direct clash between NATO and Russia, with unpredictable consequences. Others pointed out that with each Russian conventional setback, Putin's incentives to use a nuclear weapon to freeze the front lines increased. Now let's talk about the pandemic and what it revealed about our public health infrastructure. More than 3 years after the coronavirus emerged, we still do not know conclusively where it came from. The dominant early theory, that the virus jumped from an animal to a human, possibly at a meat market in Wuhan, China, remains plausible, but a lab leak hypothesis has moved from conspiracy theory to serious scientific and governmental inquiry. In 2021, 18 scientists published a letter in Science magazine calling for a more transparent, independent investigation into the virus's origins. The Wall Street Journal reported that 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology sought medical care in November 2019 for symptoms consistent with COVID-19. China refused to allow an independent investigation. What made the lab leak debate so complicated was how thoroughly it became politically entangled. Republican Senator Tom Cotton raised the lab leak possibility in February 2020, and it was quickly associated with the Trump administration's efforts to blame China for the pandemic. That politicization, argued journalist Jonathan Chait, led parts of the press to express false certainty about natural origins when they should have acknowledged genuine uncertainty. The lesson: even in a pandemic, public health communication has to be honest about what is and isn't known. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's pandemic performance, meanwhile, came under devastating scrutiny. In 2022, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky announced a major reorganization after an internal review found that the agency's response did not reliably meet expectations. The failures were concrete: faulty test kits early in the pandemic, slow data reporting, confusing messaging, including the infamous decision to discourage mask use early on, not because officials were convinced masks didn't work, but because they feared public demand would cause shortages for health workers. The same communication problems played out again with monkeypox in 2022, a less contagious virus for which a vaccine already existed. The underlying problem, many experts say, is that the U.S. public health system has been hollowed out by decades of disinvestment. Between 2010 and 2020, healthcare spending rose by more than 50%, while local health department budgets shrank by as much as 24%, and the CDC's budget remained flat. One estimate put the cost of building a genuinely modern national public health system at $8 billion per year in additional funding. And the future? Times opinion columnist Zeynep Tufekci issued a stark warning about H5N1, the bird flu strain. The pathogen has long terrified scientists because when it has infected humans, it has killed 56% of known cases. Until recently, it couldn't spread from person to person. But things are changing. The virus is infecting more wild birds than ever before, has jumped to mammals including minks, dolphins, and bears, and there are now alarming signs that it may be adapting to bind to receptors in the upper respiratory tract, the pathway that could make it airborne among humans. Tufekci argued that the world needs to act now, before H5N1 has any chance of becoming a devastating pandemic. The tools exist: surveillance networks, vaccines, antivirals. What's missing is urgency. Let's move to U.S.-China relations. In February 2023, the international incident caused by the detection and downing of a Chinese spy balloon in U.S. airspace, and the subsequent postponement of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's planned trip to Beijing, was, in Bucket Lindell's framing, just the latest episode in a longer story of deteriorating relations between the world's two great powers. Relations began seriously declining in 2018, when the Trump administration launched a trade war with China that the Biden administration continued. They worsened further after the coronavirus outbreak, and now a top Air Force general had issued a memo predicting war with China in 2025. The core concerns from the U.S. side: China's military expansionism in the South China Sea and toward Taiwan, its de facto revocation of Hong Kong's autonomy, the mass detention of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which the U.S. government designated a genocide, and broader concerns about intellectual property theft, censorship, and the export of authoritarian governance models. From China's perspective, U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, statements from President Biden about defending Taiwan militarily, and visits by high-profile U.S. officials like then-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi were seen as provocations. The stakes of a military conflict are enormous. One war game simulation found that a conflict over Taiwan would likely cost tens of thousands of American service members and devastate Taiwan's economy. A RAND study estimated it would cause a 5 to 10% fall in U.S. GDP and a 25 to 30% fall in China's, with cascading effects on the global economy. It would also likely end meaningful U.S.-China climate cooperation at a moment when the two largest emitters must work together. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin tried to call his Chinese counterpart during the balloon incident, and the call was declined. That silence itself was alarming to analysts. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the existence of back-channel communication helped prevent catastrophe. What happens if communication channels aren't working when the next crisis hits? Now, population anxiety. In 2021, U.S. population growth fell to its lowest rate on record, just 0.1%, sparking a wave of concerned commentary. But this is actually a global phenomenon. The world's average fertility rate has been falling for decades. Fertility rates in Japan, South Korea, Italy, and Greece are already well below replacement level. In 2023, China joined the list of countries whose populations are now shrinking, a demographic shift that had been anticipated but arrived earlier than projected, with 850,000 more deaths than births in 2022. China's fertility rate has fallen to roughly 1.2 children per woman, among the lowest in the world, despite the official end of the one-child policy in 2016 and cash incentives for larger families. What does a declining population actually mean? It means an aging society with fewer working-age adults to support growing numbers of retirees. It means slower economic growth. It means potential pension crises. In Heilongjiang province in northeastern China, the pension system ran out of money in 2016, the first in China to do so. But there are also potential upsides. Smaller populations could ease pressure on natural resources and slow the damage of climate change. Countries that have managed the transition well, Japan is a notable example, haven't experienced the total economic collapse that doomsayers predicted. Japan's unemployment remains very low, and its per capita GDP has held up reasonably well. What can governments do to raise birth rates? The evidence from countries that have tried, from Sweden's generous parental leave policies to Hungary's large-scale prenatalist spending, is sobering. Sweden temporarily raised its fertility rate above replacement level in 1990, but it has since fallen back down. Hungary has dedicated 5% of its GDP to encouraging larger families, and its fertility rate rose from about 1.2 to about 1.6, a modest improvement at enormous cost. Australia tried a baby bonus program for over a decade. By the time it ended, the fertility rate was lower than when it started. The consensus among demographers is that financial incentives can accelerate the timing of births that were already planned, but don't meaningfully increase the total number of children families have. In the United States specifically, the difficulty of raising children is a contributing factor to low birth rates. The U.S. is, notably, one of only 2 countries in the world, along with Papua New Guinea, whose citizens have no entitlement to paid parental leave. Half of Americans live in places with no licensed child care provider or far too few spots. 1 in 3 children doesn't attend preschool. President Biden's infrastructure plan included major investments in paid family leave, extended child tax credits, subsidized daycare, and universal pre-K. But all of those proposals ran into the wall of Senator Manchin's entitlement opposition. Now, feminism and #MeToo. If there was a high watermark for American feminism in recent years, Bucket Lindell suggests it might have been Harvey Weinstein's conviction on rape and felony sex crime charges in February 2020. But even that victory was complicated. 6 women testified against Weinstein. At least 90 had accused him of sexual assault and abuse. It is a partial victory, wrote Moira Donegan in The Guardian. Too small a victory, one after too long and great a fight. 2 years later, in June 2022, the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade marked what Michelle Goldberg called American feminism's lowest watermark in decades. The constitutional right to abortion that had existed since 1973 was gone, with 22 states expected to swiftly outlaw the procedure. At the same time, a new generation of younger people, including many young Democrats, had begun turning against feminism as a label. A poll conducted by the Southern Poverty Law Center and Tulchin Research found that 46% of Democratic men under 50 agreed that feminism has done more harm than good, compared to just 4% of Democratic men over 50. The Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial in 2022 became a cultural flashpoint. The jury found that both parties had defamed each other, awarding $10 million to Depp and $2 million to Heard. But what many observers found more disturbing than the verdict was the online environment surrounding the trial. A vast, lopsided social media campaign that turned Heard's testimony about domestic violence into viral entertainment. Makeup companies, hockey teams, language learning apps, and former boy band members all harvested attention from making light of allegations of abuse. The elaborate grassroots campaign to smear a woman will remain, wrote The Times' Amanda Hess, now with a plugged-in support base and a field-tested harassment playbook. The overturning of Roe raised the question of what comes next. Legal scholars noted that the right to abortion, as established in 1973, was rooted in a broader constitutional right to privacy, the same right that underpins Griswold v. Connecticut's protection of the right to contraception, Lawrence v. Texas's protection of gay sex, and Obergefell v. Hodges's protection of same-sex marriage. Justice Alito's majority opinion in Dobbs explicitly said those other rights were not at risk, but critics, including Times columnist Jamel Bouie, argued that claim was disingenuous. In the following weeks, several Republican politicians signaled openness to challenging Griswold. What would the legal effects of a post-Roe world look like in practice? Legal scholars noted that anti-abortion legislation focused on fetal personhood could restrict not only abortion but also IVF procedures, miscarriage care, treatment for ectopic pregnancies, and even the behavior of pregnant women throughout their pregnancies. Now, the culture wars, what Bucket-Lindell grouped under the heading of progressive culture, canceled. In the summer of 2020, a letter signed by 153 writers and intellectuals, including Noam Chomsky and J.K. Rowling, warned in Harper's Magazine that a new culture of censoriousness had taken hold, particularly on the left. What became known as cancel culture, the collective social and professional punishment of those accused of ideological nonconformity, was, in Bucket-Lindell's analysis, a real phenomenon with real costs to real people, but one that was also weaponized by the right as part of a broader campaign against wokeness. That campaign increasingly focused on education. Conservative activist Christopher Rufo identified critical race theory, an academic legal framework developed in the 1970s to analyze how law maintains racial hierarchy, as a useful catch-all term for anti-racist pedagogy in schools and workplaces. 6 states passed restrictions on what public schools could teach about race and history in the space of a few months. Florida's Department of Education prohibited teachers from defining American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. The book-banning movement accelerated. A network of conservative groups, some new, some long-standing, organized, funded candidates for school boards, and pushed for the removal of books they found objectionable. The books most frequently targeted were by or about Black or LGBTQ people. In Keller, Texas, a district outside Dallas where a company called Patriot Mobile poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into school board races, the new board restricted or prohibited books containing profanity, violence, sex scenes, or nudity, and banned books referring to gender fluidity. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale were among those removed. And transgender rights became one of the most active fronts in the culture war. In 2023, more than 150 anti-transgender bills were introduced in at least 25 states. Some were familiar: bans on trans students in sports, bathroom restrictions. Others were new territory. Bills in Oklahoma and South Carolina would make it a felony to provide hormone or surgical transition treatment to people younger than 26. Bills in at least 9 states would restrict drag shows, using definitions broad enough to potentially encompass any performance by a transgender person. A Mississippi bill declared that separate is not inherently unequal, an allusion to Plessy versus Ferguson, and would define sex as immutably set at birth, denying transgender identities under state law. Major medical organizations, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, are unanimous that gender-affirming care reduces depression, self-harm, and suicide risk in transgender adolescents. 30 to 51% of trans adolescents attempt suicide. Transgender advocates say that even bills that don't become law have measurable effects. In a poll conducted by the Trevor Project, 86% of transgender and non-binary youth said debates over state laws had hurt their mental health. Let's touch on a few more of the domestic policy debates Bucket-Lindell flagged before we close. on gun violence. The United States has nearly 400 million guns, about one for every American, and by far the highest rate of gun deaths among peer nations. After mass shootings, gun owners and non-gun owners consistently attribute the violence to different causes, which makes shared solutions nearly impossible. The Senate filibuster means most meaningful legislation needs 60 votes. The NRA, while less powerful than in the past after declaring bankruptcy, reflects genuine grassroots opposition to gun control. The Supreme Court's 2008 Heller decision enshrined an individual right to bear arms, and the court extended that in 2022 by striking down New York's laws on carrying concealed weapons in public. Meanwhile, more than 100 Americans die from gunshots every single day. On housing, across the country, Americans are running out of affordable places to live. The problem is fundamentally one of supply. The U.S. built far less housing in the past 2 decades than it needed. Restrictive zoning laws, minimum lot sizes, single-family-only zoning, parking minimums, artificially limit construction. Homeowners, who benefit from scarcity driving up their property values, often use local government processes to block new development. The result, in only 7% of counties can a minimum wage worker afford a 1-bedroom rental. On the opioid and overdose crisis, in the 12 months ending in April 2021, more than 100,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, more than from car crashes and guns combined. A nearly 30% increase year over year. The underlying cause is fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin, increasingly mixed into other street drugs without users knowing. New York City opened the first officially authorized safe injection sites in the U.S. in late 2021. Trained staff reversed 2 overdoses on the first day. The research from Europe, Canada, and Australia shows such sites reduce death without increasing crime. The core policy question is whether the U.S. will treat addiction as a health crisis or a criminal one. On the wealth tax, Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have proposed taxing the fortunes of the ultra-wealthy. Warren's proposal at 2% annually on net worth above $50 million. Sanders at a more aggressive rate that would have the typical billionaire's fortune in 15 years. Economists debate whether such taxes are constitutional, enforceable, or wise. Critics point to Europe's experience, where 12 countries had wealth taxes in 1990 and only 3 still do. They were expensive to administer, easy to avoid, and didn't raise as much revenue as hoped. Proponents like economist Gabriel Zuckman argue the failures came from poor design that can be corrected. And before we go, one of the lighter moments in the farewell newsletter, because not everything has to be existential. Back in 2019, Bucket Lindell asked New York Times food editors for their hottest takes on Thanksgiving. Opinions were divided on canned cranberry sauce. Sam Sifton endorsed mashed potatoes unreservedly. Pete Wells argued vigorously for pickles. And on turducken, a turkey stuffed with a duck stuffed with a chicken, reporter Kim Severson was unambiguous. This is bull. It's essentially performative Thanksgiving cooking. That comment drew what Bucket Lindell described as perhaps his favorite reader response ever. A clarifying email from the philosopher Judith Butler. Yes, the author of Gender Trouble, one of the most important feminist texts of the 20th century, on the technical meaning of the word performative, which Severson had used somewhat loosely. If that email helped even one college student understand Butler's notoriously difficult prose, Bucket Lindell wrote, he'd consider the newsletter a success. That's a fitting way to end a newsletter that spent 4 years trying to make complex debates more accessible to more people. The goal wasn't to tell readers what to think. It was to help them think better about the questions that matter most. That's our briefing for today, February 22nd, 2023. Thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.